Hello everyone. Today we're going to look at an enduring puzzle in the early history of the microscope. What were the pioneers actually seeing? What was their view? What did they observe? And perhaps most important of all, how accurate were their studies, their preserved drawings, when compared with what we understand in the light of today's modern microscopy? Let's go back to the doyen of the early microscopists, the hero of the microscope, Antony van Leeuwenhoek, the draper of Delft. What a remarkable man he was. I was introduced to him at school, and the more I found out about Leeuwenhoek, the more I became fascinated by the notion of what could you actually see through those early microscopes. I wrote back in the 60s how Hooke was concerned with macroscopic objects, but it was Leeuwenhoek that gave us our insights into the microscopical world. Look at these stellate cells from juncus or water plants through a modern student microscope, and compare that with the view that you get through a single lens microscope. Even back in the 60s, I could see that this was so much a clearer view than one expected. Here's a squamous epithelial cell, as a student might have looked at it through a modern microscope, and if we compare it with a single lens microscope, you can almost make out the bacteria that surround this cell. Not quite, but the cell you can certainly resolve. It made a very good two-page feature in a photographic journal. And look at this section of Zeer maze, photographed through a glass bead lens that I very crudely made. That's all you see. But if you use sunlight as an illuminant, then suddenly the picture is clearer and almost compares favourably with what you see through a modern microscope. Now, this research began to attract more and more attention. It made a very nice two-page feature in New Scientist magazine back in 1971. And it was soon picked up by other educationists who realised that we could certainly see more through those early microscopes than anybody had possibly imagined. And so my pictures were requested by the producers of educational materials, and it became quite well known worldwide. And the press, of course, became interested. In 1972, I began serious work with these old microscopes, and the press were excitedly reported that I'd been awarded £1,800 by Kodak to take pictures through early microscopes. Gave rise to a couple of books, published more than 50 years ago. They proved to be quite influential. Indeed, they influenced some of the great microscopists who seemed proud to own my books amongst their library collections. I travelled widely, of course. I went to the Boerhaave Museum and got to know many of their pioneering microscopists, including J. van Zylen, a remarkable man and a great loss since his sad passing a few years ago. In Utrecht, I was given access to the most powerful microscope of all attributed to van Leeuwenhoek. And there it is, carefully taken apart so that I can take some photographs. You see, there are two slides that I took over as test objects because I was keen to see just how much of an impediment was chromatic and spherical aberration to these early microscopical observations. I often used authentic means of recapturing the spirit of the age. I used candles and oil lamps in order to illuminate some of these early pictures. This was exacting and tiring work, but the results were just so very exciting and encouraging for the future. Peter Hans Kilstra, this avuncular, amiable, terribly clever man at the University Museum of Utrecht, is the person who arranged for me to take pictures through that early microscope. And with Dr. Robert Friedrich, watching with unabashed excitement, I created a bracket for my Olympus camera, slotted in position the little Leeuwenhoek microscope, carefully focused. I was able to grab images, the first colour images ever taken through a Leeuwenhoek microscope. The team at the museum were wonderfully supportive, and when I came back to England, Sir Andrew Huxley, then President of the Royal Society, was so keen to learn more of my research. What you could see through a simple microscope was quite remarkable. Here is a diatom frustule photographed through a modern microscope, and here it is through the best single-lens microscope, a lens ground by Horace Dall. Here it is under the high power of Robert Brown's microscope in England, and under the low-power lens. I was invited to go and present my work at the Royal Society, and Jan and I went along and set up an impressive-looking stall. I must say that the exhibit that we put on attracted a tremendous amount of attention. On the screen we had live pictures of Euglena as seen under a single lens microscope. And we were one of the hits of the show. We had a large number of visitors. Here is Sir Harold Wilson, the former Prime Minister. And many of the pictures I'd taken through a Leeuwenhoek microscope were on display in that exhibit, including this shot of elderpith, which I photographed through Leeuwenhoek's lens in Utrecht. And you can compare that with the later attempt by Brian Bracegirdle using the same lens and the same specimen to take a photograph that didn't quite match the quality that I was able to tease from that diminutive little microscope. The most exciting of all was this picture of human blood. Look at the red cells and how well they are resolved. And up in the top right-hand corner is a polymorphonuclear granulocyte, a neutrophil. This is what you think a white cell looks like when stained and mounted, and this is a picture circulated by a photographic agency. But it compares remarkably well with the view I was able to tease from that little tiny microscope, not much bigger than a rectangular postage stamp, in the collections at Utrecht. Brian Bracegirdle also tried to take a photograph of blood, but unfortunately his picture didn't quite manage to resolve cells as clearly as we had managed to obtain. Leeuwenhoek had a really good view. Look at this published engraving as one of his studies, showing the capillaries and at the top the red cells. Yet I could never get people to take Leeuwenhoek seriously. The BBC did mention him on one occasion, for example, in a programme, a show which they called Little Bang, and the dismissive way in which the presenter almost tosses Leeuwenhoek to one side, I still find almost hurtful to his memory.
Hello and welcome to Little Bang, coming to you live from Bang HQ. Tonight is all about...
Which looks like a sort of instrument of torture. Can you see what that is? It's, I won't say anything. Have a little look. I'll turn it around. Little twirl. Little lovely twirl. This is actually a replica. It was built by Richard Allen. It's actually a very, very early microscope, and this was made in the 1600s. And that little hole actually has a piece of glass in it, and it's it can magnify sort of beyond sort of 200 times. And you can see here. Don't know if you can see very closely. It's a tiny, tiny lens, absolutely fantastic. Little focus knob here, and basically this is as good as microscopes got for 200 years. It's fantastic.
I love it. That's genius.
Yes.
Famous a draper.
He was a draper. He wasn't actually a scientist. He had no science background. He was just really interested in very
Fascinating, but
small
can we
things.
move on, please?
And here is another BBC programme in which a chap called Adam Rutherford fails even to look through the right side of a Leeuwenhoek microscope.
What do I actually do? Where am I looking?
At the wrong side, you must look through this hole.
Yep. I can see green.
There is a focusing knob.
There's a focus.
Yes, there is a focusing knob.
Oh my god, you can actually see moving creatures.
Yes.
Oh wow, that's incredible. There's a tiny, tiny bug in there, which is scooting around, which I guess is a protozoa.
The Royal Society soon invited me to go and lecture on my results, and it was such a pleasure to show to this astonished, silent audience exactly what Leeuwenhoek would have been able to see back in the 1600s.
For the first time, this is what he actually saw, and this, ladies and gentlemen, is what Leeuwenhoek sat and watched in the 1600s. These little grazing protozoa, they're a genus called Stylonychia, and you can see how they almost move like fast woodlice or little mice. If you'd like a look at one of these Stylonychia in more detail, here we are. It's in a thinner film of water, so it can't move quite so fast. Isn't that an extraordinary sight?
I showed a picture that Dr. Oyedamari had taken. The comparison is memorable, isn't it? And let's look at Leeuwenhoek's studies of wood. Here is a section of wood, a modern section of wood photographed through a conventional microscope. And if we go back and look at Leeuwenhoek's drawings, this is how he portrayed the same specimen. What a remarkably clear and accurate drawing that is. But of course the first person to popularise the microscope was Robert Hooke of the Royal Society. So let's look at his great book, Micrographia, published in 1665. Turn the page and you will find his drawings of snowflakes. That's a rather cheeky drawing, in the sense that these pictures have all been stolen from an Italian who had already published them. These are Robert Hooke's drawings, And if you want to look at Bartholin's pictures, which had been published several years earlier, there they are. The comparison between the two is absolutely unmistakable. Hooke was always quick to complain when other people like Newton stole or plagiarised his work. But in actual fact, he was a plagiarist too. And it does show that plagiarism goes back to the roots of microscopy. So now let's look at his picture, his most famous picture, that of cork, a longitudinal and transverse section of cork. And if we look very closely, you can see the meticulous detail with which he's drawn it. So let's compare that with the view of a cork section cut by Leeuwenhoek in the 1600s, taken under a scanning electron microscope, the Cambridge stereo scan that I used at Cardiff University. And as you can see, the comparison between the electron micrograph and the picture that Hooke portrayed in 1665 is really remarkably close. In my book, The Revealing Lens, that came out 51 years ago, I showed Hooke's drawing and a photograph taken through a similar microscope of what he would actually have seen. But this view is through a single lens microscope. This shows the details of cork that you could see with just a single magnifier. There is far greater detail in this image than Hooke was ever able to portray in his engraving. And here's his drawing of a mosquito larva. This is what it looks like under an early microscope. You can see the images clear enough. You can make out what's going on. You can see the water flea and you can certainly see the larva. But you cannot see the detail that Robert Hooke portrayed in his scholarly and accurate drawing. So let's compare that with the clarity that you get through a single lens. And here is the head of that same larva, but this time photographed with a single lens microscope. And suddenly, all of the hairs, all of the details, all of the fine structural configurations that you can see portrayed in Robert Hooke's diagram, they're visible. You did not see them with a compound microscope, but with a single lens you can. And so here is the engraved picture as Robert Hooke published it in 1665. And how might that compare with the view through an early compound microscope? Well, you can see the outline of the organism well enough, but you simply cannot see the details that Robert Hooke portrayed in his drawings. But suppose instead we have a look through a single lens microscope, and suddenly the fine details appear. The resolution has increased, and so for the first time ever, I'm able to demonstrate to you how these images actually compare. So when we produce a present-day study of the mosquito larva, this is what we see. It has much in common with what Robert Hooke originally portrayed in 1665. There on the left is the view through an early compound microscope. The detail that was missing you can see in the picture on the right. And now I do want to show you something really exciting, something that nobody has ever seen before. And that is, how did Robert Hooke's engraving of a nettle leaf compare with what a nettle leaf actually looks like? Photoshop allows us to adjust the positions of the spines on the leaf of a nettle, so I can show you an exact comparison between what Robert Hooke engraved and what I recently observed. Here is Hooke's engraving in his book of the stinging nettle leaf. And this is what the stinging nettle leaf actually looks like under a present-day microscope. For the first time, we can reconcile the image of reality with the way in which Robert Hooke tried to portray it all those years ago when preparing the drawing and engravings for his masterful work. That is how we now see a nettle leaf, and this is how Robert Hooke saw it back in 1665. This really is a remarkable comparison, and for the very first time we can reconcile what we now see with what they saw then. His comparison with reality is almost breathtaking. It's one of the most dramatic pictures in his book. And this is Vorticella, a little water-cleansing ciliate that lives on its little stalks in ponds all around the world. You rarely find them in salt water, but they abound in water that's fresh. This is how Leeuwenhoek might have seen it. This is the view of a single vorticellid cell taken through a single lens microscope. And you can make out the details surprisingly well. Leeuwenhoek could clearly observe Vorticella, but how would he portray it? He actually sent a drawing in a letter in October 1676 to the Royal Society. And tucked away in the corner, almost as an afterthought, is a tiny little drawing that shows a colony of Vorticella, quite unmistakable for a microbiologist's eye. This is how it was engraved by the Royal Society's publishers, and if you look at it closely you can see a perfect little colony of Vorticella. And how does that compare with the modern view? Well, and how would he have seen it? Well, these are all Vorticellas photographed through single lens microscopes with remarkable clarity, and here is the living thing. Now we can see, for the very first time, we can actually see how his drawing compares with actual observable reality. It's quite remarkable to reflect back to that sketchy drawing in the margin of a letter in which Leeuwenhoek had his limner portray Vorticella for the very first time in history. The new breed of historian scholars seem to have scant knowledge of microscopy and to have published little on Leeuwenhoek. So my first aim is to show how an original drawing like these habdotrophic rotifers was interpreted for print by the engravers in London. The positioning of the images from proceedings of the Royal Society, once digitised, can be carefully adjusted, and I can then move to a video micrograph of the organisms that Leeuwenhoek was actually observing. This video was provided for me by Dr. Bob Burden in Canada. Nothing like this has ever been done before, and it does provide an immediate insight, not only into the engraver's skill, but into Leeuwenhoek's quest for unerring accuracy. Never before have scholars had the opportunity to make comparisons like this. These are timely revelations which revolutionise our understanding of the origins of microscopy. In recent years, a couple of scholars have decided to plagiarise all this work and pretend it was done by them all along. One of them is Sietske Fransen. Sietske Fransen, you will recall, is the person who had a press release issued by the University of Cambridge, by the Max Planck Institute, by the Boerhaave Museum, and by the Royal Society itself, explaining that they had actually managed to take a look at what Leeuwenhoek saw through his microscopes for the very first time. And she has now been joined by this chap called Erik Jorink in the Netherlands. Mr. Jorink is an interesting chap, and he's enterprising too. He has managed to claim a grant of over $800,000. So just have a look at what the money is for. We're going to repeat the very first experiments of scientists like van Leeuwenhoek, that should be a lowercase v, using original van Leeuwenhoek microscopes. That way we can see for ourselves what they could see and how they expressed it. I had a sense of déjà vu when I wafted back to that newspaper cutting from the 1970s that said I was going to take colour pictures of microscopic images as they would have appeared to the pioneers of the science in the 17th and 18th centuries. As has been said many times at this meeting before, if you can't think of an original idea, just steal someone else's and hope nobody notices. The trouble is, of course, everybody does. And just how much support there has been for this research over the years. You'll see that the Royal Society and the American Microscopical Society were among those awarding funds. And so many distinguished academics and scholars helped so much, from Lord Perry and Sir Andrew Huxley to Peter Zone and Gary Laughlin. While the research was published in Nature and New Scientist, in Microscopy Today, Scientific American, and in so many others, in the 1990s, the Encyclopedia Britannica Yearbook and the Washington Times Magazine were among those featuring the research, along with television companies from across Europe and Asia. In the present century, the total of my own publications has exceeded 260, and my research was featured on national television news from London and in a host of specialist journals from Nature to several major textbooks. Most recently, you'll find current papers in journals including Microscopy and Analysis, The Microscope, Imaging and Microscopy, and many others. The complete bibliography now exceeds 400 publications. Meanwhile, what of the Royal Society? Well, they have continued to act as if all the research is being done by them, and what's more, being done now. I gave a lecture to celebrate the 300th anniversary of Leeuwenhoek's sad demise in 1723 last year. To a largely American audience of enthusiasts aboard a cruise ship. The Royal Society missed his birthday by a month, and when they did, they managed to get together an audience of 40 or 50 people. One or two of the speakers did refer to my research in passing, but the meeting was full of mistakes. I smiled when I saw poor Professor Cobb introduced by an exuberant speaker as Professor Cab.
Able to chair this session and introduce our wonderful speakers for this evening, Professors Matthew, Cab, and Catherine.
Those problems, those ideas which we now face, were present way back at the very beginning of the history of microscopy, when people were honestly trying to explain what they had seen and draw it in order to convince other people. So, thank you.
It's going to be hard to beat that one. Let's see.
That's no way to commemorate the research of somebody as distinguished as Leeuwenhoek. Come back a decade when I spoke at the Microscopy and Microanalysis meeting in Hartford, Connecticut. This is an audience responding to Leeuwenhoek. This is how he should be remembered.
And so, ladies and gentlemen, I think it is time that we pressed for a revolution in our understanding of the origins of the microscope. This is a great and glorious discipline, and I want to leave you with this picture. This is what Leeuwenhoek saw in the 1600s. No, it wasn't tiny, tiny, fuzzy little things scooting around. He wasn't looking through tiny, tiny bits of glass. He was looking through beautifully made lenses at fabulously detailed images, and was laying the groundwork for the discipline in which we all find so much satisfaction today. What we've been told is filled with errors, and it's high time we woke up to it, because this image is the origins of microscopy, and in many ways the roots from which today's bioscience era has sprung. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Thank you. Excellent. Thank you very, very much. Thank you all.